I am 39 years old, and the first thing people usually notice about me is how calm I am with money, or at least how calm I used to be. Because calmness was never about confidence for me, it was about fear, about knowing exactly how fragile stability is when you grow up watching it disappear. I work as a project manager in a mid-sized logistics company, not glamorous, not high risk. The kind of job where you learn to think in timelines, buffers, contingencies, where you are rewarded not for bold moves, but for avoiding mistakes. Money, for me, was never a symbol of status or ambition. It was insulation. It was distance from panic. It was the quiet certainty that if something broke, my health, my job, my marriage, I would not immediately fall apart. That belief shaped almost every adult decision I made. For 10 years, I saved with the same discipline other people reserve for religion. I skipped trips, delayed buying a home, drove the same aging car long after it stopped being charming. I tracked every expense, automated transfers, read contracts twice. By the time I turned 38, I had accumulated exactly $120,000. Not approximately, exactly. That number mattered because I could tell you where every dollar came from: overtime bonuses, unused vacation payouts, years of modest raises that never changed my lifestyle.
That money was not an investment portfolio in my head. It was my future apartment, my emergency fund, my proof that restraint worked. And then, one morning, I woke up and opened my banking app out of habit, not panic, and saw that the number was no longer there. I didn't feel shock right away. I felt confusion, like when you misplace an object you know you just had and assume the mistake must be yours. The loss itself would take time to become real. Back then, at the beginning, everything still felt orderly, explainable, professional. The first contact happened months earlier, through someone I already trusted enough not to question my own caution. His name was Daniel, a former colleague from a previous job, someone I respected not because he was flashy, but because he was precise. We had worked together for years without incident, exchanged occasional messages after I moved companies, the usual LinkedIn-adjacent professional distance. When he reached out suggesting we catch up over coffee, it didn't register as unusual. People reconnect all the time. Over coffee, he didn't pitch anything. He asked about my work, complained mildly about corporate bureaucracy, mentioned he had transitioned into a consulting role for a firm that specialized in structured capital placements. The language was dry, almost boring. He knew that tone would matter to me. A few weeks later, he sent me an article about inflation eroding cash reserves. Nothing sensational, just a neutral analysis. I read it because it aligned with concerns I already had but never acted on. Another week passed, then a spreadsheet. Not an offer, just an example. Numbers laid out cleanly, scenarios labeled conservative, moderate, worst case. He never used the word guaranteed. He never rushed me. What he emphasized, again and again, was risk management. He framed the opportunity not as a chance to grow wealth, but as a way to protect it. The structure, he explained, was designed for people exactly like me, disciplined savers who didn't want exposure to volatility, but also didn't want to watch 10 years of effort quietly decay. I asked questions, many of them. What if liquidity was needed early? What safeguards were in place? What happened in adverse market conditions? Each answer came with documentation, footnotes, references. There were calls with other people present, muted microphones, professional slides. No one promised me upside that felt unrealistic. The phrase that stayed with me, repeated casually, was "the downside is limited." Limited downside felt like a language I understood. At no point did I feel excited. That should have been my warning sign, but instead it reassured me. Excitement is what I distrusted. Calm logic was what I followed. Over the following month, the idea settled into my routine the way all serious decisions in my life had, quietly, incrementally, without drama. I imagined my $120,000 not as being at risk, but as being repositioned, sheltered, working without being exposed. I told myself I was being responsible, adapting to reality, not clinging to habits formed in a different economic climate. I even delayed the decision longer than necessary, rereading the materials, waiting for my instinctive discomfort to surface. It never did. What I felt instead was a slow, subtle pressure, not from Daniel, but from my own reasoning. If I had spent 10 years building this safety net, wasn't I obligated to protect it properly? Cash, sitting idle, began to feel like negligence rather than prudence. The final step didn't happen in a dramatic moment. It happened on a Tuesday evening after work, laptop open, apartment quiet, dishes drying in the rack. I logged into the portal I had been given. I reviewed the terms one last time. I noticed how familiar the interface already felt, how normal the process seemed. The transfer confirmation screen asked me to verify the amount. I remember pausing, not because I sensed danger, but because typing $120,000 felt ceremonial, like closing a chapter. I told myself that this wasn't a gamble, it was a structure, a system designed to reduce risk, and that doing nothing would actually be the reckless choice. I clicked confirm. I watched the loading icon spin, and when the confirmation message appeared, understated and professional, I felt a mild sense of relief. Nothing dramatic had happened. No alarms, no warnings, no sudden doubt. Just a reasonable decision, made calmly, that I would not be able to undo. After the transfer, the days didn't change in any visible way, which I took as confirmation that I had done something sensible rather than reckless. There was no dramatic shift, just a new tab I checked alongside my email and calendar, a dashboard that showed my money sitting where it was supposed to be, categorized, allocated, labeled with language that sounded deliberate and controlled. The firm sent a welcome packet a few days later, a dense PDF. I read it in the evenings the way other people read novels, slowly, line by line, highlighting passages that mattered to me. Everything aligned with what Daniel had explained. The numbers weren't aggressive, the projections were modest, almost conservative to the point of being boring. I told myself that if there was one thing I knew how to evaluate, it was boring systems. That was my entire career. Over the next few weeks, there were scheduled check-ins. Nothing intrusive, just brief updates, confirmation emails, a monthly summary that showed exactly what it was supposed to show. No growth spikes, no red flags, just stability. I noticed how deliberately unexciting it all was, and how much that appealed to me. At work, I was overseeing a multi-month rollout that depended on avoiding surprises, and I remember thinking how similar the logic felt. You don't eliminate risk by pretending it doesn't exist. You manage it by spreading it, documenting it, planning for it. When I compared this structure to leaving $120,000 in a savings account earning almost nothing while inflation quietly shaved value off it every year, the comparison felt obvious. Saying no at that point would have meant admitting that 10 years of discipline ended in inertia, that all my caution had produced nothing but fear of action. That internal argument became more important than anything Daniel said. He didn't push. He didn't need to. Every time I raised a question, he responded with either a document, a call with someone else present, or a reference to an external audit. The system seemed designed to answer skepticism rather than suppress it. There were even moments I felt mildly frustrated by how slow and procedural everything was, which again reassured me. Scams move fast. This didn't. Around the second month, there was the first small confirmation that I hadn't expected to matter as much as it did. A distribution report showing a minor yield allocation. Not money withdrawn, just an accounting entry. But it was precise down to the dollar and matched the timeline they had outlined from the start. I didn't gain anything tangible, but psychologically it shifted something. The structure was doing what it said it would do. I remember thinking that if this had been about greed, I would have felt impatient, restless, constantly checking for upside. Instead, I felt settled. I even stopped checking the dashboard daily. Responsibility, to me, had always meant putting systems in place so you didn't have to rely on emotion. That was exactly what this felt like. I started explaining it to myself the way I would explain it to a junior colleague. This isn't about chasing returns, it's about protecting purchasing power, about being proactive rather than passive. I ran comparisons in my head between this and the so-called safe alternatives people default to. Government bonds barely kept up. Real estate required leverage and exposure I wasn't ready for. Index funds fluctuated in ways I couldn't control. This, by contrast, was structured, buffered, segmented. It fit my personality. The first inconsistency appeared so quietly I didn't recognize it as such at the time. A scheduled report arrived 2 days later than usual, accompanied by a brief note about an internal reconciliation delay. It wasn't alarming. In my job, delays happen all the time for reasons that have nothing to do with failure. I accepted the explanation without friction. When the report did arrive, the numbers were still within expected parameters. Nothing was missing. Nothing had changed. I told myself that focusing on minor timing issues would be paranoid. Another week passed, then another, and there was a slightly different wording in an update email, a reference to temporary liquidity alignment. I reread it twice, not because it scared me, but because I wanted to understand it fully. Daniel clarified it in a call, calmly, with slides, explaining that these were normal adjustments already anticipated in the structure. I nodded, took notes, felt the familiar comfort of a system explaining itself. I noticed that I had started defending the decision internally before anyone challenged it externally. When a friend casually mentioned that he preferred to keep things simple and liquid, my immediate reaction was to think he was being short-sighted. That surprised me. I had always been the cautious one, but now caution had shifted its meaning. Caution meant doing the work to protect what you had, not freezing it in place. Over time, I began to see my $120,000 not as something vulnerable, but as something already protected by layers I didn't need to monitor constantly. That psychological distance mattered. It made the money feel less like a pile of personal sacrifice and more like a component in a system. When Daniel mentioned, almost in passing, that some clients with similar profiles chose to consolidate rather than stagger allocations, I listened. He didn't recommend it outright. He framed it as an efficiency consideration. Fewer moving parts, clearer reporting, simpler oversight. I asked what that would mean for me. He explained it would streamline exposure and reduce administrative friction. The language was subtle, reasonable. I reviewed my position that night, saw how fragmented it was by design, and considered how much mental energy I was still spending thinking about timing. Consolidation felt like the final step toward making this truly hands-off. I told myself that hesitation, at this stage, wasn't prudence anymore. It was inconsistency. I had already accepted the framework, the logic, the risk profile. Holding back part of the funds would mean acting on an emotional attachment to the money rather than the rational strategy I believed in. I slept on it, expecting doubt to surface. It didn't. The next evening, I logged in, initiated the consolidation process, and authorized the transfer of the remaining balance so that the full $120,000 sat within the same structure. When the confirmation appeared, again understated and procedural, I felt something close to satisfaction. Everything was aligned now, clean, efficient. I believed, genuinely, that I had finished the hard part, and that from here on out, the system would do what it had been carefully designed to do. The first signs that something was off didn't arrive as fear, they arrived as inconvenience, the kind that feels too small to justify anxiety, but persistent enough to register in the background of your day. A report that used to come on the first Monday of the month arrived mid-week, accompanied by a short explanation about processing volume. Then a scheduled call was moved, not canceled, just shifted. I remember feeling faintly irritated rather than concerned, as if my time, not my money, had been disrespected. I told myself these were growing pains, administrative noise. At work, I dealt with similar issues constantly, and the worst mistake you could make was overreacting to every deviation. So I didn't. I adjusted. I waited. The dashboard still showed my $120,000 allocated across the same categories, still labeled, still numerically intact. I reminded myself that this money represented 10 years of discipline, 10 years of saying no to short-term comfort, and that panicking over timing would dishonor that effort more than patience ever could. When explanations came, they came dressed in familiar language: market recalibration, counterparty alignment, temporary liquidity constraints. None of those phrases implied loss, just delay. I repeated that distinction to myself often. Delay is not loss. Delay is not loss. At night, though, my sleep started to fragment. I would wake up around 3 or 4 in the morning with a vague sense of urgency, not dread exactly, but alertness, as if there was something I was supposed to be monitoring and wasn't. I began checking the dashboard before bed, then again if I woke up, telling myself I was just staying informed. During the day, small irritations set me off more easily. A slow cashier, an unnecessary meeting, an unanswered email. I didn't connect these changes to the money directly, because consciously I still believed everything was under control. When friends asked casually how my finances were, I heard myself defending the decision before they even questioned it, explaining the structure, the safeguards, the logic. Their neutral reactions felt vaguely unsatisfying, as if they weren't acknowledging how responsible I was being. The first moment of real cognitive dissonance came when I tried to explain the structure to myself without referencing the materials. I realized I couldn't. I could repeat the language, but not reconstruct the mechanism. The system that had once felt transparent now felt abstract, layered, dependent on processes I didn't fully grasp. That realization made me uncomfortable, but not enough to stop. I told myself that complexity didn't equal danger, that many effective systems are opaque by necessity. I scheduled another call. The call happened, the answers were calm, the slides were updated. I nodded along, took notes, reassured myself that professionals were handling details I didn't need to micromanage. Still, the delays accumulated. Reports arrived later and later. Distribution schedules were adjusted, then adjusted again. Each time, the explanation made sense in isolation. Global conditions, temporary volatility, alignment issues that were already being resolved. I noticed that the tone of the communication hadn't changed, which paradoxically made it harder to challenge. There was no defensiveness, no pressure, no visible stress. Everything remained professional, measured, courteous. That made me feel unreasonable for feeling uneasy. At the same time, I began calculating what losing $120,000 would actually mean in ways I had never allowed myself to before. Not in abstract terms, but concretely. It meant no apartment, not even a modest one. It meant starting again at 40 with no safety net. It meant that every skipped vacation, every deferred purchase, every late night at work over the last decade would retroactively feel pointless. I told myself those thoughts were irrational catastrophizing, the kind of mental spiral disciplined people avoid. But they came anyway, uninvited, especially when I was tired. One evening, after refreshing the dashboard for the 5th time in an hour and seeing no change, I felt a sudden, sharp sense of distance from the money, as if it no longer belonged to me in a meaningful way. It existed on a screen, in reports I didn't fully understand, subject to timelines I couldn't control. That was when it hit me that I was no longer making active decisions, only responding to situations created by past ones. I was trapped not by contracts, but by my own consistency. Admitting doubt now would mean admitting that the calm logic I trusted had failed me, and that felt more dangerous than waiting. So I waited. When an email arrived explaining that certain redemptions were temporarily paused to preserve overall stability, I read it carefully, twice, 3 times. The word paused was emphasized, not restricted, not lost. I latched on to that distinction. I asked what could be done to expedite resolution. The response suggested an option, framed carefully as voluntary, a way to optimize positioning during the pause, to improve recovery timelines once normal operations resumed. It wasn't presented as a requirement, just a strategic adjustment. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the weight of 10 years pressing against a decision that now felt less like choice and more like obligation. The idea that getting my money back might require one more step settled into me slowly, heavily, and despite the unease tightening in my chest, I found myself considering it. The loss did not arrive as a single moment, but as a sequence of small confirmations that slowly removed every remaining place for doubt. The first was an email written in careful, neutral language, informing clients that a review process was underway and that account access would be temporarily limited while records were being reconciled. I read it at my desk during a normal workday, the office humming around me, and felt nothing more than mild irritation. Temporary had become a familiar word by then. I told myself it was procedural. When I tried to log in later that evening, the dashboard loaded differently, stripped of detail, showing placeholders where numbers used to be.
There was no zero, just absence. I refreshed the page several times, waiting for the data to populate, convinced it was a display error. The next day, a scheduled call was replaced with a written update, shorter than usual, less explanatory. It referenced external factors, regulatory engagement, timelines that could not yet be confirmed. I noticed that the language no longer described processes, only outcomes that would be communicated later. I felt a tightening in my chest then, not panic, but a dull pressure, like something heavy settling where certainty used to be. I sent a measured reply, asking for clarification regarding my specific position, the full $120,000 I had consolidated, the money I had saved over 10 years with the assumption that caution would protect it. The response took 2 days to arrive. When it did not mention the amount. It stated that individual balances were subject to the results of the ongoing review and that further updates would follow. That was the moment the numbness began. Not fear, not grief, just a flattening, as if my nervous system had decided that feeling nothing was safer than feeling too much. I continued going to work, answering emails, attending meetings, while my body reacted in ways my mind hadn't caught up with yet. I lost my appetite. My hands felt cold even in warm rooms. I checked my phone constantly, not expecting good news, just needing the next piece of information, whatever it was. When the next message arrived, it was not addressed to me personally. It was a general notice stating that due to unresolved issues with counterparties, client funds could not be recovered. The sentence was written in the passive voice, as if no one had actively done anything. I reread it multiple times, waiting for my brain to translate it into something actionable. It didn't. It simply stated that the process had concluded and that no further remediation was possible. There was no dramatic language, no apology that felt personal, just a closing line thanking clients for their patience. I stared at the screen, aware of my heartbeat in my ears, aware that I was breathing too shallowly, but still unable to connect the words to my life. I picked up the phone and called my bank, not because I thought they could fix anything, but because I needed someone to say it out loud.
The representative listened politely as I explained, stopping occasionally to ask clarifying questions. When I finished, she paused and then said gently that because the funds had been transferred out months earlier and were no longer under the bank's custody, there was nothing they could do. She asked if I wanted to file a report, mentioned timelines, disclaimers. Her voice was calm, practiced. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. I sat on the edge of my bed and tried to think through the numbers, to reconstruct the logic that had led me here, but my thoughts slipped away before they formed. I called my sister that evening, not to ask for help, but because I needed to hear myself say the words. I told her I had lost $120,000, every dollar I had saved over 10 years. There was a pause on the line, then a quiet intake of breath. She asked how. I said I didn't know how to explain it yet. She didn't offer solutions, she just said she was sorry. In that moment, the reality finally settled. This wasn't a delay, it wasn't a technical issue. The money that had represented my future apartment, my safety, my proof that discipline mattered, was gone. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange, hollow exhaustion, as if something fundamental had been removed and my body was still adjusting to the absence. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anger. I felt an empty space where 10 years of effort had lived, and for the first time since I started saving, there was nothing there to check, nothing to plan around, nothing to protect. In the weeks that followed, my life became smaller in ways that were not immediately visible to anyone else. I still went to work, still paid my bills on time, still answered messages with the same neutral tone, but the internal structure that had supported those routines was gone. Without the $120,000 I had saved over 10 years, every decision felt heavier, less buffered, as if there was no longer a margin for error. I noticed how often I had relied on the idea of that money without actively thinking about it, how it had shaped my sense of who I was, a careful person, a disciplined person, someone who could be trusted with responsibility. Losing it didn't just remove financial security, it quietly dismantled that identity. I simplified my routines not out of strategy, but out of instinct. I stopped browsing real estate listings, unsubscribed from newsletters that assumed future planning, avoided conversations that drifted toward long-term goals. It wasn't that I felt ashamed, it was that those topics no longer applied to me in the same way. Relationships shifted subtly. I found myself less inclined to give advice, less certain when people talked about smart decisions. I listened more, spoke less, aware that confidence now felt like something you borrow, not something you earn permanently. I thought often about why the promise of minimal risk had worked on me so completely. It wasn't greed. If anything, it was the opposite. It appealed to my need for control, to my belief that if I gathered enough information and behaved rationally enough, I could insulate myself from chaos. The language of risk management, of structures and buffers, had mirrored the way I approached my entire life. I had trusted it because it sounded like me. The money itself, I realized, had never been about comfort or luxury. It was about proof. Proof that restraint was meaningful, that sacrifice accumulated into something solid, that patience could be measured and relied upon. Without it, I had to confront the uncomfortable truth that discipline does not guarantee protection, only the illusion of it. That realization changed how I saw effort itself. I still worked hard, still saved what I could, but without the quiet conviction that these actions would inevitably lead somewhere safe. The long-term consequences were not dramatic, but they were persistent. I delayed commitments, avoided financial entanglements, chose stability over possibility more rigidly than before. I became more cautious, not in the productive sense, but in a narrowed, almost defensive way. Some nights I would replay the decisions in my head, not to assign blame, but to understand the moment where trust shifted from being a tool to being a vulnerability. Over time, the intensity of those thoughts faded, replaced by a dull acceptance. The loss stopped being a daily presence and became a background condition, like a chronic ache you learn to move around. One evening, months later, I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I had just finished paying bills, closing the browser tabs one by one, noticing how short the list was now. There was nothing left to optimize, nothing left to protect beyond the immediate. As I turned off the light and stood there in the dark for a moment, I realized that what I missed most wasn't the money itself, but the version of me who believed that careful planning could make life predictable. And in that silence, I understood that this, more than the loss of $120,000, was what I would have to live without.